Hi, my name is Charles Hua, and I am an alumna of Harvard College, and it's my honor to be presenting here at the Harvard Climate Action Week at the studio. So today I'll be talking about how we can accelerate clean energy and equity through utility regulation. So first, why does this topic matter? Well, if you're one of the 200 million folks who have used ChatGPT, you might know how revolutionary of a technology artificial intelligence is. But you might not know how much electricity AI uses. In fact, it's driving significant increases in electricity demand, and that's putting a strain on our current electric grid. So let's take a look at what's happening in Georgia, for instance. You have Georgia Power, which is the utility company in Georgia. There is so much investment in data centers, AI, and manufacturing that the grid can't handle it down there. Because there is so much of an increase in electricity demand, there needs to be an increase in electricity supply to meet that demand. Now, how is the utility Georgia Power looking at increasing the supply of electricity? It's looking to natural gas. So in October 2023, Georgia's utility developed what's called an interim integrated resource plan, which basically is a plan that spells out how the utility intends to invest its capital expenditures. And so Georgia says, with Georgia's utility, that it needs to generate more electricity using natural gas. Now that poses a significant threat to its own climate and emissions reduction goals. Georgia Power being a utility that has a net zero goal. Now fast forward to April 2024, just 2 months ago, and Georgia Power received approval to add 1,400 megawatts of natural gas generation. And there's a lot of environmentalists who are criticizing the approval that the regulatory body, the Georgia Public Service Commission, made to allow for the utility to build all this new fossil fuel generation. Now, there's other reasons beyond climate impacts to be concerned about what's happening with Georgia Power. There's also affordability concerns, where building that natural gas is going to cost Georgian ratepayers a lot of money, particularly as we've seen there's high volatility in gas prices, where, for instance, with the Russia-Ukraine crisis, gas prices spike significantly. And so who ultimately will shoulder the risk of those cost increases? Well, it's the ratepayers in Georgia. But there's also reliability concerns. You know, we've seen, for instance, just in the US, Winter Storm Uri, Winter Storm Elliott cause significant blackouts and substantial strain on the electricity grid. Part of why that is that a lot of the gas units didn't work as the utility expected. And so that's a problem. But ultimately, the final decision was made, and the regulatory body for the monopoly utility in Georgia ultimately allowed the utility to proceed with essentially everything that it asked for. Now, this is not just unique to Georgia. This is part of a nationwide trend. Again, as we use more electricity, we need more supply for that electricity. And so there's a lot of utilities across the country that are looking to meet that demand with new fossil fuel builds through these gas plants. So just 5 utilities, so Duke Energy in North Carolina, Dominion Energy largely in Virginia, Arizona Public Service in Arizona, We Energies in Wisconsin, and Georgia Power in Georgia. Just these 5 utilities are looking to build nearly 25,000 megawatts of gas. Now, one of 2 things will happen. They'll be built, and if they're used, that puts the United States emissions reduction and climate goals out of reach. And if they're not built, then the utilities will have invested significant capital expenditures in something that ultimately the ratepayers will have to pay, and that will create stranded asset risks for Georgian ratepayers, neither of which is a great scenario. Now, if we look at a broader trend, we are not on track to meet our clean energy targets. So if you look at the last 6 years, the historic levels of clean energy deployment have been roughly 25 gigawatts of clean electricity capacity. There are teams that have modeled both where we need to go in terms of future clean electricity deployment, as well as forecasted clean energy additions after the passage of the landmark Inflation Reduction Act legislation. But there is a tripling of that pace of clean energy deployment that we need just in these next 5 years, before this end of the decade, to meet what's forecasted. So why the gap? Well, a lot of it is on the regulatory side of the equation. We have policies like the Inflation Reduction Act and the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. From a financing standpoint, we have significantly more capital and investment flowing to clean energy technologies. From a technology standpoint, these technologies have substantially improved and the costs have come down significantly. But from a regulatory standpoint, there are still a lot of regulatory barriers to the accelerated deployment of clean energy. That includes anything from the need for permitting reform. So how do we permit and site these clean energy projects? That includes what's called interconnection queues. So to build these clean energy projects, there are long lines that the entities building those projects have to wait in before they can get their projects connected onto the grid. And then there are regulatory bottlenecks at the state level in terms of the approval of these clean energy projects. So let's talk about some of those. But in the meantime, while we have this climate and clean energy crisis, we have an affordability and equity crisis, where nearly 1 in 3 Americans struggle to pay their energy bills. That means that they're foregoing basic necessities like education, food, shelter sometimes, just to be able to afford turning on the lights. And a lot of utilities have shut them off of the system. Even the elderly, even those suffering from medical conditions, even during extreme conditions, be it natural disasters or pandemics. And so there's a mismatch here where we have utilities and utility companies that are making record profits all at the same time that 1 in 3 Americans can't afford their energy bills. So what's causing a lot of this? Well, a lot of it is the regulatory system, where the regulators for these utilities are routinely approving fossil fuel projects that have particularly harmed low-income and environmental justice communities. This isn't just a regional trend, this is a national trend with Alabama, West Virginia, Michigan, Georgia. And a lot of the time, the regulatory bodies have not helped ratepayers, whether it's approving rate hikes, allowing utilities to increase their expenditures to ultimately earn greater returns. And there have been various scandals as a result of this. Yet because very few people know what a public utility commission is, oftentimes these bodies, both the regulators and the utilities, comprise the system that ultimately has not been subject to the level of accountability that's necessary to make sure that ultimately it's the ratepayers that are protected moving forward, in addition to the potential climate and clean energy implications. So what are these bodies, these public utility commissions? Well, every state has them. They regulate the investor-owned utilities in your area. These utilities are not public companies. They're actually private companies that are investor-owned. They're monopolies that were granted by the state. And these regulators are there to make sure that the utilities are doing their job. Econ 101 says that if you have a monopoly, you need a regulator. And that's the public utility commissions. Now, they're the guardians of an equitable clean energy transition because they oversee our energy bills. Next, how much our utilities invest in clean energy versus fossil fuels, and where these projects are located. Next. So that means that the 200 people, the 200 public utility commissioners across the country, oversee nearly $200 billion in annual utility spending, a number that's only going to grow. Now that comes out to about $1 billion per commissioner. And again, every state has one. You can look up who your public utility commissioner is, and that person, that set of people, each one oversees nearly $1 billion in utility spending, and that's just capital expenditures. Now, how is that broken down? Well, your electricity bills go to pay for a range of components of the electricity system. That includes the electricity generation. So those are the solar, wind, coal, natural gas, and nuclear plants that power the electricity system that allow you to turn on your lights. It's also the distribution expenses, which are the local poles and wires in your neighborhood. It's the transmission system, which is the long poles and wires that you see along highways. And it's gas. For instance, with continuous build out of gas pipelines. Now, all of these components are growing in cost, except for generation. And that's precisely because clean energy has gotten so cheap that it's now cheaper in the vast majority of instances than continuously operating existing fossil fuel plants, such as coal. But these regulators need to make sure that the balance of these investments is such that you, as the ratepayer, are ultimately protected. And so that's why it matters for you to pay attention to who your public utility commissioner is. Oops, go back. So what do we do about this? How do we address the electricity challenges that I talked about earlier with all this increased demand in electricity due to artificial intelligence, due to manufacturing, due to electric vehicles and heat pump adoption? Well, the good news is that we have a range of solutions at our disposal. So if you look at that blue bar on the right, that is the forecasted growth in peak electricity demand moving forward. So it's about 90 gigawatts. Now, the range of 8 technologies on the left in green there represent solutions that we have at our disposal today that don't require further technological innovation or new inventions that will allow us to address that increase in demand without needing to build expensive new fossil fuel plants and mitigating the need to build new transmission, which we still need to do a lot more of, particularly those transmission lines that cross states. But let's just take a look at these 8 technologies and what do they do? So the first 4, they unlock effective transmission capacity. Now, that's a fancy way of saying that these 4 technologies, if we deploy them at scale all across the country, all across the poles and wires that are scattered across the country, if we deploy those, they're going to be able to allow us to meet that increased electricity demand simply by connecting the different electricity generating units across the country, be it the wind farms in Iowa and Kansas, the solar farms in Georgia or Arizona, to the places that need them the most, which are those metropolitan areas that are gobbling up significant electricity demand. And the great thing about these technologies is that they're cheap. They will save you, in many instances, money on your electricity bills, particularly the 3 in the middle there: dynamic line rating, topology optimization, and advanced power flow control. Now, without getting into the weeds of what these technologies do, basically what they do is at low capex, if you deploy them, they make the system a lot more efficient. It runs better. More electricity can be sent through those poles and wires, and it'll save you as a ratepayer money. Now, who's in charge of making sure that they're deployed? Well, it's the utilities, and it's the regulators, those public utility commissioners that I mentioned. And same thing for the 4 lime green technologies in the middle there. They will create relief on our grid system that is increasingly strained without the need to build significant new poles and wires to the same degree as you would without deploying these technologies. And so that's why they're called often non-wires investments. So that's things like energy storage. That's things like virtual power plants, which are aggregations of your rooftop solar, your neighbor's electric vehicle, your church's heat pumps. It pools it together and then serves effectively as a new power plant. That's why it's called a virtual power plant. That is cheaper, cleaner, reduces your electricity bills, it can improve the reliability of the system and help us address the challenges that are facing the grid. So let's go back to those public utility commissioners, the pesky regulators that will determine whether or not we advance an affordable, a reliable, and a sustainable electricity system. So what can you do about this? Well, there's 3 things in particular that I would call out. First is, you can push for the appointment and election of good utility commissioners. Again, everybody in the United States has 3, 5, or 7 people in that state that serve in these roles that are setting their electricity bills, determining how the utilities are investing in different forms of energy, determining and overseeing whether the utilities are looking out for you and advancing the public interest. And in 40 states, either the governor, usually the governor, sometimes the state legislature appoints those commissioners. And in the other 10 states, they're elected. So you can look up your public utility commission and see whether it's appointed or elected, and make sure that the people that are serving in those roles are truly there to look out for you. The second thing that you can do is to call up your state legislator and tell them that they need to make sure that they are looking out for you, that they're looking and holding the public utility commissions accountable, but also empowering those public utility commissions to do their job effectively. Now, a lot of these public utility commissions are significantly under-resourced, understaffed. They have some of the hardest jobs in the world. But that's where the state legislators can come in by giving them more resources, more budgets, and more tools to be able to advance utility regulatory reform and make sure that your energy bills are as low as possible and that the energy generation on the system is as clean as possible. And the last thing is to engage in these proceedings. These are largely public venues. It's called the Public Utilities Commission. But find a group, perhaps your neighbors, perhaps your local church group or environmental group or your parent-teacher union, and engage with these proceedings. Your voice needs to be heard because you are the ones that are paying the energy bills that result in the utilities and their investments. And the public utility commissioners need to fundamentally make sure that your interests are constantly being not only protected, but advanced. And that's only possible if you engage in these public utility commission proceedings. If you're interested in these topics, you can reach out to me at charles.hua, H-U-A, the number 2 at gmail.com. And I'm always excited to talk more about the need and opportunities for reforming the utility regulatory system. So thanks for having me, and I look forward to seeing what you all do.